And for some analysis on this now, we are joined by Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, the Horn of Africa Policy and Security Analyst, and he joins us via our Zoom link. Thank you so much for joining us, Abdullahi. If you can just bring us up to speed, what is the latest coming out from Sudan?
I think the latest is there are various efforts, both multi and bilateral, that is trying to ensure that the two generals, at the very minimum, allows for ceasefire that is concrete, ceasefire that can hold, but that is not doing any job because fighting is continuing. Displacement, like your reporter said, is ongoing. I just want to make it very clear. Sudan has got one of those distinctions as a country that generates refugees and displacement, as well as a country that hosts a lot of refugees. In total, there are 1.1 million refugees in Sudan, and you've got 2.3 million people who are displaced inside the country. So in terms of people who are now going to move out, we've got three outcomes, right? There are people who are already in Sudan who are now leaving for Chad, for Central African Republic, Egypt, as well as Ethiopians and other neighboring countries. There are other people who have sought refuge in Sudan. Now those ones have to leave as well. And there are others now have to find ways of getting out of the country. You know, communities like from Southern Sudan, where the vast majority of them are inside Sudan, are going back. Here's the challenge, though. The region is not renowned for economic stability, political, economic and political stability. So it's a fairly fragile region. So what you have is for countries like South Sudan and Chad, Sudan, especially Khartoum, is actually a hub. And for instance, Chad hosts already 0.4 million refugees, a legacy from Darfur conflict of 20 years ago. But now already we have got 20,000 that have flown. Internally, because the health infrastructure is incredibly fragile, already even before the conflict, humanitarian situation is dire. 1 in 3 Sudanese require humanitarian aid. Health infrastructure is non-existent practically. In Khartoum, for instance, over 60% of health infrastructures have been destroyed. Humanitarian actors have become a target. So on top of that, you have conflict between these two generals and their army or their combatants, but there are others as well. So it makes for a grim reading for a foreseeable future.
And of course, Abdullahi, coming to the issue of these two generals, surely there are now efforts to come and speak, to both sides, these two warring sides. Surely this is a positive move here, to try and find stability in Sudan.
It is, not just for the Sudanese, but also for the region. The region cannot afford Sudan, a country with almost 50 million people, to be in turmoil. We know what that means because the region, the Horn of Africa, is a region that is already buffeted by multiple crises. You've got climate change all the way from Somalia that is almost leading to, famine. You've got conflict in Ethiopia that is only 6 months since the signing of cessation of hostilities. You've got conflict in South Sudan where 2/3 of the people in the country require humanitarian aid. So you cannot afford another country that is going to be unstable. And really the challenge in terms of finding stability is we are seeing increasingly African crises, political and security crises, at a time when Western countries' leverage are fairly diminished. That means countries like that are second or third tier in the global power indexes, then much as they might not have the leverage to bring them together, they have got the capacity to actually be bad faith actors. Here I'm talking about Gulf countries, you're talking about Russia. And so you're suddenly finding yourself, in terms of resolving some of these outstanding problems and leverages, you will need, all right, more than one pathways rather than just one pathway. And that requires coordination, cooperation, and many other stuff.
And of course, we have also seen that there is this latest ceasefire of 7 days, which has been requested. And with this meeting that is being asked by these two generals, do you think that this time around, maybe this ceasefire can hold? Because, you know, the last ceasefires, those were not fully complied with.
I mean, like, as a continent, we live on hope, right? We live on hope that the 7-day ceasefire will hold. We live on hope that in those 7 days, mediators that are meeting in Jeddah will be able to come together and, you know, drill senses into the generals. But I just want to paint 3 scenarios on how this conflict could end. One, it is having that peace deal as a function of the current ceasefire, which leads to, you know, an impeded humanitarian access, political reality, and all other transitional justice mechanism at the end. Secondly, if we don't have that, that is the best case scenario. You know, a middle way is, you know, one side of this conflict completely defeats the other one and then takes charge of the de facto of the instrument of the state. At this stage, that is fairly impossible because whereas the army, that is Sudanese Armed Forces, have got the advantage when it comes to regular warfare, but in a trench, street to street, RSF is fairly adept. So we will not have that. And third and finally, what you might have is a protracted conflict. Sudan has a history since its independence of being ruled by generals and coups and counter-coups. This is expected. Sudan also has a fairly rich history of violence. You know, in Darfur, 20 years of conflict has not been resolved to date. We have internally displaced people in Darfur. We have got people who have left Darfur. And I think for the next few weeks and months, we need to keep an eye on Darfur, Western Darfur, and in places like Al Janeina, because that is where the bulk of RSF comes from. And that is not going, they are not going to relinquish their fight anytime, any easily.
Yeah, and we've just seen now that the United Nations, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres has made his way to the East African region. What do you think this means, especially in efforts of trying to calm the situation?
I think what you hope that the SG will achieve is for the regional countries, Kenya, including South Sudan, IGAD, the regional bloc, as well as the African Union, to pull their weight behind a ceasefire. You know, if you get a ceasefire, there are no shelling, there are no artilleries, there are no guns, there are no snipers. Humanitarian groups can, you know, move in and try and provide humanitarian aid. Absence of that, you'll not be able to offer humanitarian aid in a country that, you know, its infrastructure is already incredibly fragile. So I think the hope is the SG will be able to cajole, the SG will be able to prevail upon these two actors via Nairobi, via Juba, via Addis, and via Jeddah to see for them to see a sense and then come to a negotiating table. And let's be very clear, that is not going to be easy. Even if they do come to the table, there are so many things that needs to be resolved. And one of those is the security arrangement. RSF, under transitional framework that was agreed, was meant to disband or at least be join the, you know, the formal army to General Dagalo. That is existential because that is his negotiating table. That is the only thing that he can bring to the table. You're not giving me this, I'll be able to go and cause violence and mayhem. So if you take that away from him, it's not going to work. And General Burhan want to be seen as the leader. So we are finding ourselves in a fairly intractable situation, even if we have a ceasefire. So we need to begin thinking in 2-3 orders. One, cessation of hostilities holds, then we have an impeded humanitarian access, and then the negotiation starts, including what we call the transitional justice to get accountability for those who committed egregious human rights violations.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. That is Abdullahi Boru Halakhe there, who was joining us via our Zoom link, just talking about and bringing us up to speed, essentially, around the situation in Sudan.